Well, hello and welcome to today's launch of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre and Workplace Gender Equality Agency's Gender Equity Insights 2025 report, The Power of Balance. My name is Catherine Fox. I'll be your host for today's event. I'm a journalist, author, commentator with a great passion to see better outcomes for women in the workforce. I spent a long time at the Financial Review where I wrote on that issue. And before we get started today, I'd like to invite Emeritus Professor Simon Forrest, a Wajak Noongar Elder and Curtin University Fellow, who'll deliver the welcome to country.
Kaya Wanju. Hello and welcome. My name is Simon Forrest Burungu. I'm a Wajak Baladong Noongar with kin connections to Yamaji and Wongai peoples. I am of this land and place. I follow a bloodline of people who have walked and cared for this land for over 40,000 years. This is a welcome to country, a welcome to Wajak Noongar Buja. A welcome to country recognises and acknowledges us and the first and continuing custodians of this land, Australia. Nidja Bolo, Nidja Gungungap, Nidja Margarap, Nidja Mindarap. Kaya Wanju, Nan Quell, Simon Forrest Burungu. Kaya Wanju, Nidja Wajak Noongar Buja. Nal Karich Noongar Mod. Ken Karat Nidja Buja. Nan Karich Noongar Kabali, Morankoriye.
Hello again. If you've just joined us, welcome to the BCEC WGEA Gender Equity Insights 2025 online national launch. For anyone requiring live captions, can I just direct you to go up to your meeting controls, click on More, go to Language and Speech and turn on live captions. And thank you very much to Simon Forrest for that welcome to country. I'm actually on Camaragal land and I pay my respects to elders past and present. We're delighted so many of you are joining us for today's actual 10th report in this series of Gender Equity Insights. And as always, the report this year will shine a light on practical actions to help drive gender balance in workplaces. I guess it's not a surprise to say the report shows some progress and some areas where still a lot of attention is needed. And given what's been going on around the world, I think it's an important time to be looking at robust data. So it's always important, but I think at the moment in particular. The report makes the point that gender equity is not simply a matter of fairness, although of course fairness is a very key factor, but that organisations that achieve balanced leadership are more likely to outperform their peers in company value, profitability and resilience. Gender balance, we know, improves decision-making, leads to stronger innovation and enhanced capacity to navigate shocks, that area of very important resilience. You're going to hear more on all of these points today. Let me outline how today will run. We'll start off with some remarks from the WGEA CEO, Mary Wooldridge. That will be followed by a summary of the excellent findings in the research by BCEC Director, Professor Alan Duncan. Then we're going to a panel discussion and audience Q&A, very important, of course. We're very pleased that Michelle Cam, the Vice President Talent and Performance at BHP, will join Alan and Mary and myself for the panel discussion. Fascinating story to tell about BHP. At any time at all during today's stream, if you've got a question, please go to the Q&A box at the top of your screen and put that up. If you would like a question directed to a particular panellist, if you can just make a note of that. Otherwise, of course, we're also happy to take questions that are directed to the panel as a whole. But let's get started. And I'd like to welcome Mary Wooldridge, CEO of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. Mary joined the agency in 2021 with a wealth of experience from a distinguished career in public, private and not-for-profit sectors. She served in the Victorian Parliament between 2006 and 2020 and contributed to significant progress in representation, strategy and policy relating to gender equality and violence against women and their children. Over to you, Mary.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Catherine. And thank you for your role today and every day in promoting gender equality. You were very modest in not mentioning, and I want to mention for the audience, your recent book, Breaking the Boss Bias, which I would recommend to people as very, once again, insightful into progressing gender equality. I'd also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders on the many lands across the country that we're meeting today, and I'm on Wurundjeri land, and as I say, pay my respects to elders past and present. And it is very exciting to launch the 10th in the series of the BCEC WGEA Gender Equity Insights. It's been really important work, and I think today we are continuing the debate about gender equality in workplaces, and the results from Alan's amazing insights and analysis do add weight to the evidence that gender equality is good for business. This builds on the report from 2020 of the causal relationship between balanced leadership teams and profitability and company value, and that's a very important piece of evidence that adds weight to the debates that we're having today, and in many workplaces and nationally and internationally across the board. Alan's going to go into more detail in terms of a number of the findings, but I did want to flag just a couple of things from our perspective. It's really important, and I think the report today highlights the need for intentional actions, that this is not going to happen by osmosis, and it needs very intentional action to make sure that we can get balance in our composition and in our leadership structures and across industries and occupations. We need to be tackling structural and cultural barriers, and we do need the importance of accountability in relation to that performance. And while gender balance and gender composition is the goal, it's often measured at a point in time. And so what we do know is behind that sits attraction, appointment, and retention. And that's what needs to be managed every day, those processes that are happening everywhere in order to get the momentum that we need. And importantly, a lot of that sits with our line managers. It's not sitting with HR and D&I teams. They're really critical. The CEO and the C-suite are really critical, but the line managers are absolutely fundamental to getting the shift and the change that we need to see. Importantly, today's report does reaffirm, not surprisingly, the work that WGEA is doing and the recent reforms, including publishing employer gender pay gaps and the transparency and accountability that comes with that, and also the new requirement for large companies to select and meet gender equality targets, including at least one that's numeric relating to composition or the gender pay gap. And to do that, it's absolutely fundamental that a comprehensive gender pay gap analysis is undertaken. So important work, and really looking forward to Alan's more detailed work going through that. I do want to take the opportunity to acknowledge, Alan, your work and the team at BCEC. We really value our decade-long partnership. And as I've reflected on the journey with this being the 10th year, the work has built an incredible evidence base and covered really varied but important topics such as things like the actions employers can take to improve gender equality, the increased effectiveness when data is reported to the board, how we get greater female representation on boards and how that reduces the gender pay gap, gender segregation and its link to the gender pay gap, the link with pay gap analysis and improved gender pay gap outcomes, and including gender pay gap by postcodes, and also important work just last year in relation to the relationship between part-time work and flexible work arrangements as important for enhancing women's participation. And of course today, as I've mentioned, enhancing the causal relationship between women in senior leadership and company performance and other really interesting aspects as well. So congratulations on the work. Thank you for the partnership. The analysis and the insights have really stood the test of time, and we really value the work that's been done and the contribution to improving gender equality. We know over the last 10 years there's been a reduction by 7.5 percentage points in the gender pay gap. We're still at 21.8, so there's still a long way to go, but there's no doubt that this work over an extended period of time has been a significant contributor to the outcomes we're seeing for employees in Australian workplaces. Thanks also to the WGEA team who have supported this work over many years, and particularly this year I do want to call out Elise, Hilary and Emma in particular, and many others who have been very involved. So looking forward, Alan, to hearing the more detailed insights and celebrating the value of the partnership and the important contribution it's made to the evidence about accelerating change in gender equality in Australian workplaces. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you very much for mentioning my book. I assure you there was no collusion, but I was just thinking how many times I've actually cited this particular piece of research, and also, of course, the excellent data that the agency compiles. It's a very rich and very much appreciated, especially if you're someone like me who comes from journalism and writing. It's wonderful to have. Also really great to hear the mention of the word intentional. I think absolutely crucial. Let me now introduce Professor Alan Duncan, Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre. As you've heard, he's been at the helm of this research for the last 10 years, and he will now give us a presentation of the research findings. Over to you, Alan.
So thank you, and Mary, thank you also for both your kind words and for your part in what we regard also to be a really valuable partnership. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for today's launch of the BCEC WGEA Gender Equity Insights report for 2025. We also acknowledge the custodians of the lands that we're meeting on across the country and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm speaking to you from the beautiful lands, the Budja of the Whadjuk Noongar people. So today we share new evidence on what drives gender balance, where progress has stalled, and how employers can convert transparency into transformation. And as mentioned, this is a business story as much as an equity story. The prize is stronger leadership pipelines, lower turnover, and higher company value. We now have a decade of national evidence to back that up. Two messages up front. First, fewer than 1 in 3 employers have a gender balanced workforce, and only 1 in 4 report gender balanced leadership teams. There has been progress, but it's fragile and it's uneven. Second, the value of WGEA's world-leading data collection is that it can point very clearly to what works. This includes policies that provide support and flexibility to workers, lift women into leadership, and encourage retention. When employers make balance a leadership KPI, the dial moves. Only 27% of organisations now meet the 40-40-20 benchmark of at least 40% of women and at least 40% of men in the workplace. Service sectors are moving fastest, but heavy industry is stuck. This isn't a story that fixes itself with time. It shifts when employers act deliberately on recruitment, development, and retention, when those actions are tied to accountability. And gender segregation is one of the most important structural barriers to workplace gender equality in Australia. Some sectors are breaking through with improved gender balance, but stark industry divisions still remain. So this table shows Australia's map of gender balance across industries, with businesses in each sector categorised according to workforce shares of women and men. As mentioned, sectors are ranked according to the shares of businesses that meet the 40-40-20 criterion. We've sought sectors in order of those shares, and that's shown in the dark box in the middle of this table. So overall, just over 1/4 of organisations across all industry sectors are gender balanced, while 36% remain either male-dominated with less than 40% of women, or female-dominated with more than 60% of women. Businesses in the accommodation and food, finance, arts and recreation, IT, media and telecoms, and rental, hiring and real estate sectors all feature with the highest shares of gender-balanced workforces. But coming second last is the healthcare and social assistance sector, where nearly 80% of workers are women, but where only 7.4% of the sector's businesses are gender balanced. And at the bottom of the list is mining, where less than 1/4 of employees are women, and with only 2.9% of organisations hitting the 40-40 benchmark. And this is a really useful demonstration that gender balance needs to be targeted both by male and female-dominated industries and businesses. Now, the panel aspect of WGEA's data collection is one of the most important and powerful features, because it means we're able to look at whether the same businesses have changed their gender composition over time, whether or not they've changed their policies and settings over time. We find some big movers over the past 3 years, again, in arts and rec, in IT and telecoms, in accommodation and food, in transport and postal, and in finance. We can also break down changes to gender balance by managerial status. So the vertical on this chart shows the share of employers with gender balance among managers, and the horizontal shows the share of workforces with balance amongst the non-managerial workforce. Arrows pointing to the northeast are good, with arts and rec, accommodation, food, IT and telecoms, agriculture and finance all showing progress towards gender balance, both for managers and non-managers. And these shifts are unlikely to be accidental. They're more likely to reflect clear targets, the normalisation of flexible and hybrid work options, role modelling among leadership, and attention to pay audits, workplace settings, and career pathways. But some others have retreated. For example, fewer organisations are achieving gender balance in the education and training sector, in retail, and in rental, hiring, and real estate. And so this highlights an important insight into Australia's journey towards workplace gender equality. That is that momentum is in no sense guaranteed. It stalls when resignation gaps open, when flexibility is not normalised, and when succession planning doesn't extend to profit and loss roles. Sectors with arrows pointing to the southwest quadrant of this chart warn us that gains can be reversed. Businesses need to be remaining watchful and take care not to take their eyes off the prize. And another slightly frustrating regularity is the degree of inertia shown by some sectors in the journey towards gender balance. Mining, construction and manufacturing remain stubbornly male-dominated, with only a small fraction of businesses reaching the 40-40 benchmark. So this should set off alarm bells in my own state of Western Australia, given the heavy representation of mining and resource companies that we have here. And businesses should take care to shift the balance of their workforce. The issue here is that a lack of awareness of either conscious or unconscious bias leads to a narrowing of talent pipelines, accentuating skill shortages, and risking leaving value on the table. Instead, progress towards gender balance needs to be a strategic centerpiece for businesses, not a compliance afterthought. And how are Australian companies progressing towards gender balance in leadership and on boards? Well, board representation has progressed in Australia by whichever metric we choose, but this chart still shows we have some way to go. So the share of 40-40-20 boards in green has more than doubled over a decade to just over 1 in 4 boards in 2024. The average of the within organisation shares of women on boards in yellow is approaching a third, and the overall share of women on boards in blue is now over a third. We also find that women's board representation across larger ASX companies has risen to 4 in 10 seats. But we now need the same accountability applied to senior leadership and line management roles, where some firms still lag well behind. Gender balance in leadership has generally improved over time for businesses across all sizes, but much slower progress has been made among company leaders and top managers. For the top ASX listed companies, the top 50, women now account for nearly a third of CEOs and executive managers. Shares of female leaders were a little lower for mid-range ASX 200 businesses and between 28 and 29% depending upon company size. Now this is encouraging, but there does look to be something of a plateau on the latest WGEA data. And with this as context, the policy challenge for businesses is to broaden and accelerate change in the executive suite, because this is where the impact on strategy, culture, and company performance is most direct. On KMP gender balance, the education and training sector leads, with 38% of organisations maintaining a gender balanced leadership team in dark green on the horizontal bars here. But heavy industries continue to lag behind, and this is a concern. CEO pipelines will stay narrow if the stepping stone into profit and loss, strategy and line management roles remains male-dominated. And what about strategies to lift the dial and shift towards workforce gender balance? So for this year's report, we take a look at workforce dynamics and especially trends in appointments, promotions and resignations to see whether or not this offers some insight into how companies are reaching a more balanced workforce. Women are more likely than men to be appointed into workforce roles relative to their current workforce shares. For managers, it's just under a quarter of women, around 3.4 percentage points higher than for men, again, relative to their workforce shares within those roles. And the overall appointment rate for women non-managers is just over 40% relative to their workforce shares, nearly 4 percentage points higher than for male colleagues. And that's encouraging because if there's a higher rate of appointment relative to workforce shares, that means that the gender gap is going to close. But unfortunately, we also find that resignation rates are also higher for women relative to their workforce shares. Managerial resignations are lower than for non-managers, and the gap has eased slightly in 2024, but relative rates are against women's retention. And now here's the kicker. We find that higher female resignation rates are the strongest force pulling balance backwards. And this makes sense. More women resigning inevitably erodes progress towards gender balance from recruitment and promotion. Our modelling is crystal clear. Lift women's appointment rates and reduce women's resignation rates, and you move towards balance. Promotions help, but they're complementary, not sufficient on their own. This is why integrated recruitment and retention strategies really matter. Retention is decisive. This means work design that supports flexibility without penalty. It means manager capability that supports progression. And it means workplace cultures without fear of career cliffs if employees move to part-time or hybrid roles. Recruitment without retention is a revolving door. Now, Australia's overall gender gap between women and men in total remuneration is estimated at 21.8%, as Mary mentioned, with the more stable gender pay gap in median pay reaching around 19%. But this year's WGEA data collection is the most comprehensive yet collected, and for the first time, the data include detailed occupational classifications data for large employers. And these data permit a clearer look beneath the headlines and allow us to explore the role of occupational segregation in driving gender pay gaps. Specifically, we pool together and plot the distribution of occupation-level gender pay gaps for different employment types, covering full-time, part-time and casual roles, and permanent versus contract positions. And when we look at how gender pay gaps are spread across employment types and occupations, a pretty high share have relatively small pay gaps. Many occupations are now within 5% of parity on a horizontal or like-for-like comparison. And around a third of occupations show pay gaps of 3% or less. Nearly half fall within 5%, and close to 7 in 10 sit within 10%. So this tells us that gender pay gaps narrow considerably once women and men are compared within the same occupational class and employment type. Compositional differences for most of the observed aggregate gender pay gap are where the differences really lie. And that's even before we take account of further controls for characteristics such as age or education or firm level differences. So the big driver of the overall pay gap is structural. Who does which jobs and how careers advance? And that's why pipeline design matters so much. But something else shows up when we look at gender balance and gender pay gaps for different occupations. So this chart plots the gender balance against occupation level pay gaps for different occupations and different employment categories. Each point represents an employment occupation combination. So for example, over 60% of dental practitioners on full-time contracts are women, and the gender pay gap for this occupation is 32.2%. Now, if we analyze these combinations across all occupational classes, we find a clear negative association. Occupations with higher female shares tend to record smaller gender pay gaps, including in some cases pay gaps in favor of women. This pattern is strongest for permanent and contracted full-time workers. It's also evident when we look at casual workers, but to a lesser extent. And this is, of course, consistent with the notion that casual roles often operate under flatter pay scales or award rates that reduce the scope for larger pay disparities. The main exception is for part-time permanent roles, where we find the relationship to be essentially flat. But overall, the implication is that occupations dominated by women are far less likely to have gender pay gaps in favor of men, but male-dominated occupations tend to display larger disparities. And so, how much of Australia's overall gender pay gap is from horizontal pay differences, or as we tend to call it, like-for-like pay gaps? Now, we answer this question using statistical modelling. We start with a raw gender pay gap, and then progressively control for differences between individuals, age, education, occupation, labour market status, and the industries in which they work. WGEA's employer data also gives us the ability to examine pay patterns between women and men within the same organisation. And this is super important. While it would be illegal for an organisation to pay their female and male workers differently for the same job, it's perfectly appropriate and certainly not illegal for one organisation to pay their workers higher wages than another organisation for the same occupational role. And this means that part of an occupational gender pay gap may stem from different pay rates between organisations for the same occupation, even though each may pay their own workers the same salary regardless of gender. And what do we find after all of this? Well, we find that the pay gap in total REM drops from 21.8% to just 5.3% once we've controlled for those observable differences. In other words, very little of the original gender pay gap is due to pay differences between women and men within a given occupational class. Now, does improved leadership gender balance drive better business outcomes? This question continues to provoke animated debates in policy circles and amongst commentators. Advocates have made the case on grounds of fairness and equal opportunity, but it wasn't until the 2020 Gender Equity Insights report that Rebecca Castles and I were able to present convincing evidence that gender diversity at the top is profitable as well as fair. But the debate has grown more contested. We've seen diversity, equity, and inclusion programs face strong political backlash in the United States, with critics claiming that DEI initiatives distract from core business or threaten merit-based workplace principles or impose costs on businesses without commensurate benefits. And part of this narrative has started to seep into Australia's own policy discourse, which is why objective, evidence-informed analysis is more critical now than ever. So this report builds on the 2020 evidence. We use updated data and methods to test whether the positive link between leadership diversity and firm outcomes continues to hold. We use updated information on different market-based measures, from Tobin's Q, which is popular, as a measure of net company value. It's based on market capitalization relative to total asset value. We use accounting measures, including earnings before income and tax, net profit margin and dividend yield, and we also assess whether businesses outperform their sector across 3 or 4 performance metrics. Now, we break down organizations by the gender balance of their leadership teams to see whether or not there are any obvious associations worth noting. For example, this chart shows that organizations with more gender balanced leadership generally outperform their sector on industry benchmarks. Businesses with either moderate or balanced leadership teams are more likely to be in the top echelons of performance on measures of company value, and similar patterns are evident for dividend yield, net profit margin, and for outperformance. Now, this is an interesting case as far as it goes, but it's a pretty inexact test. There are so many other factors that determine performance beyond just gender balance, and simple correlation can't resolve that issue. And so, to move beyond correlation, we use stats modeling to separate the influence of gender balance in leadership from other drivers of company performance or differences in company performance. So as I mentioned, we take advantage of the innovative approach that Beck and I worked on for the 2020 Gender Equity Insights report. We use panel regression methods to link changes in female leadership shares over time to subsequent business outcomes. And we again find that moving towards balanced executive teams is linked to higher company value and profitability. For example, for a $1 billion worth valued firm, the uplift in value averages around 93 million and can be as high as 120 million, depending upon starting balance. So this is a material shareholder outcome. The effect of a move towards gender balance depends upon the starting point of leadership gender balance, however. For example, firms with low shares of female CEOs or executive leaders see a larger and positive impact when women are introduced into leadership. The effect is also strong where more than 60% of leaders are women, but where there is a move towards gender balance through greater male representation in leadership. Where leadership teams are already relatively gender balanced, any further movements towards equality in the gender composition of leadership leads to relatively minor increases in company value. And the effects of moving towards gender balance tend to be more pronounced for mid-cap firms valued at between $1 billion and $5 billion. And so, here's the playbook. Set leadership balance targets and link them to governance. Track resignation patterns and fix the leaks. Normalize flexible work so that advancement and hybrid work coexist. Redesign entry pathways into trades, tech, and P&L roads for women, and care, education, and health pathways for men. Anchor the ESG S metrics to WGEA's reporting for credible, comparable measures. And treat balance as a core business strategy, not as a compliance afterthought. We're 10 years into the series and we tend to know what works according to the data. Appointments drive balance, retention sustains it, accountability locks it in. Balanced leadership teams lift company value and deliver resilience, and employers who act now can win the race for talent and performance. So the choice is simple: step up and lead, or stand still and fall behind. Smart money is on balance. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alan. An enormous amount of incredibly interesting areas there that we could cover, and I suspect speak about for a long time. But we will, of course, now have the panel. Can I just remind you all to send in your questions, because we would love to make the most of this fantastic panel and all the information that's being presented to you. So please remember to go to the Q&A and send us those questions through. So I'm welcoming back Mary, but I'd also like to properly introduce Michelle Cam, VP of Talent and Performance at BHP. Michelle leads strategies to win and invest in the best global diverse talent for the company, and that involves creating clarity on the labour skills and people needed, and also in building a talent reward and performance environment that ensures people thrive and perform to their potential. So wonderful to have you with us, Michelle. Don't be put off by being on the bottom of the table. What I think is incredible, actually, is what we've been hearing from BHP. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists a question, and then we'll certainly come to your own questions. But Michelle, can I start with you? The work that BHP has done has been quite public. We've read a lot about it. I've certainly been following it with a great deal of interest. There was a target set, and I believe you've actually reached your 40% target, even ahead of time. There were two areas. I'd love you to give us a bit of an overview, but there were just two areas that Alan's research and the agency's research has picked up on that I know BHP has addressed, and I think it'd be fascinating to hear from you. One is this issue of resignations and retention of women. So I'd love to hear what BHP's been doing. And then in the non-managerial area, building the pipeline and some of the work that BHP has done, including with TAFE, to set up the Future Fit Academy, to actually producing a very healthy pipeline of women workers right through the organisation with those skills, which can sometimes be very difficult to source in the general populace. So just those were the two that I wondered if you could run us through, please.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And before I start, we have made some great progress, but we are always learning, and sometimes from our mistakes. But we also try and make a really good intention around learning from external research and other organisations. So thank you, Professor Duncan, and to Mary, as usual, for this wonderful partnership, and happy 10th anniversary for the 10th report. So to answer your question, Catherine, we have actually had a look at retention and resignations. And what we've really learnt here is that it's something that you do need to watch. It's never static. And so we have seen periods in our history where women have had higher rates of turnover than men. And so what we've done is we've actually looked into reasons as to why. And importantly, those factors do change over time. So we did see pay and benefits coming up the reason list through the cost of living crisis more recently. But we do see some thematics there. And some of those thematics are around career and development opportunities. They're also around the sorts of leadership and the environment in which people are working. And importantly, what we have seen come through is that the environment and the work and the rosters are actually fit for purpose for individual stage of life. And so that's helped us really narrow and shape our interventions. So what we've done is we've actually built what we call a bit of a marketplace, so that when individuals, say a woman who is pregnant and can't go underground anymore for health reasons, or can't get on a flight to do those FIFO shifts, we actually have built a bit of a capability or a team that looks after redeploying those individuals. So that's been really an important shift for us. In addition, what we have also seen is that when individuals are close to getting into promotion windows, we're actually coaching not just them, but also their leaders. How do you actually build the development and ensure that people are taking and getting equal access to those opportunities? And that's in addition to some of our long-standing development programs, like our supervisor development programs. So that's something that we continue to watch with interest, and we have seen retention levels come down and stabilise, which is great. And there was a really sustained period of time over the last financial year where we've actually seen retention of women improve drastically. On the second area around non-managerial roles, this is something that we have looked at quite intensively as well. And when we have actively and intentionally, I liked that word, it made intentional action to bring in women, we have a disproportionate number of women in our new to entry or new to industry roles. And that can actually affect our pay gap. Because they tend to be those lower paid roles relative to more senior roles. So what we've actually done is that we've looked at our pipeline, and it's very easy to say, well, there aren't enough women who are interested in mining, or there aren't enough women with the trades or the skills that we need. So what we actually did, to your point, is we've partnered with TAFE and other qualifying accrediting institutions to create our own apprenticeship and traineeship programs. And we're really excited that in some graduate classes, we've been able to reach more than 80% women in our graduates.
That's fantastic. I was just over at the Women in Mining Summit in Perth.
Excellent.
And I must say, it's such an eye-opener. And just to see the incredible number of younger women who were going into the sector. So not to say there aren't challenges, but yes, it was quite uplifting. And Michelle, I dare say, kind of obvious, I guess, but you must be delving into some of these issues. You're looking at these issues in quite a lot of detail. Otherwise, you clearly wouldn't be working out what are the inhibitors, the things that are preventing retention and so on. So again, it's putting that lens intentionally and getting that research done too. Yeah. Mary, can I ask you, it's slightly frustrating in a way to ask you this, but when we look at the sectors where we've seen more gender balance, they're quite disparate actually. I mean, you've got the arts and recreation, the accommodation and hospitality sort of areas, and then finance actually coming further up. What do you think employers in those sectors have really been concentrating on? What have they actually been putting a real amount of effort in to help them get, to progress in that area?
Thanks, Catherine. And I should say, first of all, it is interesting when you use balance as your measure, because we also look at the gender pay gap. So because there is balance, and we know that's important, doesn't necessarily translate into good gender pay gap outcomes as well. So, I take the finance sector, who has one of the highest gender pay gaps. So I think they have worked hard to ensure they're recruiting both women and men across the board, but they still have dramatic differences in who are in the high paid roles and who are in the lower paid roles. Some of the like retail and others have smaller gender pay gaps. So there's clearly, been more balance in relation to those two. But I think we do see, for the sectors, and those ones have improved over time, and particularly, once again, credit to finance sector in terms of that improvement, is it has been a target, a commitment in relation to the sector. They've done the analysis, identified where the gaps are, sought to proactively address where those differentials lie. Sometimes it's redesigning the nature of the roles, and I think where we see, some of that is reasonably straightforward. Other aspects of it is hard. And so if I go to the finance sector once again, what we often see is, those deal-driven environments that are high pressure, very consuming, greedy jobs that are non-substitutable. They've still got some very big issues to grapple with in terms of how do we ensure that balance is reflected not only in aggregate across a sector or even across an employer, but within the employer across the different roles and occupations as well. So, I think, I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think it is doing the work. It's It's knowing that detail, it's working that through, and taking steps to address each of it. And, you know, we can celebrate progress, but there are, you know, still many gaps to address, even within those industries which we're acknowledging today.
Just a related quick question too. I noticed the report points out that industries that have publicly committed to leadership diversity, or where regulators have applied some pressure, tend to make faster progress. And that's an interesting one given the current climate. What are you seeing there, that sort of public commitment? I'm just going to be completely, in my realm where I still report on this and write about it, that I think there's been a real pulling back from that public commitment. So I just wonder what you're seeing and what the potential ramifications of that are.
I think what we are hearing from employers more than collective at the moment is that some of the ramifications of the broader debate is not that the work's going to stop, but maybe the articulation of the work is going to be reduced a little bit, which, you know, is, you know, so important that the work continues. But we do think the celebration, acknowledgement and reflection of that work is really critical in the process. But there are some things where industries need to, you know, it's very hard for employers. And what we don't want to, you know, have the situation is where, you know, an employer is sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul type situation where, you know, the senior managers within an industry are all swapping within, you know, to different roles and different employers, but we're not actually growing the industry at all, which is why it's exciting to hear examples like Michelle's talking about. How do we bring new people in, bring new capability, you know, bring women into masculinized industries and grow that rather than just, you know, be swapping within. And so there are, you know, we do think, especially in those heavily feminized and masculinized industries, there are opportunities to reflect more broadly on how does the industry, you know, present itself in all its glory, you know, in terms of things like safety, in terms of things like stereotypes about who does the roles within it and who works with them, and particularly those training pipelines to come in and then succeed, you know, in a career throughout. So they are things that industries can do that, you know, many employers are seeking to tackle, but industry action can help to accelerate that change.
Yeah, fantastic. And Alan, just quickly before I open up to audience questions, not that it's a quick answer, I suspect, but if you could give us just a sense of where do you think, or what has been the impact of this report? 10 years, what's the reach and what sort of change have you seen from the data?
Look, it's been a real journey. When the partnership was established, you know, this was very much this are the early days of exploring the data collection, WGEA's data collection. We couldn't have dreamed how much insight we've been able to draw from those data over a 10-year period. It's truly a national treasure. The WGEA reporting data is incredibly valuable. I mean, and we talk about it being world leading, but it's genuinely world leading. You know, the WGEA data source, you know, of course, it's there's sort of limits to the size of organizations that are within the WGEA data collection, but and there are other data sources that look to, you know, employee pay gaps and allow us to track that over time. There is no source of data that allows one to connect up employer and employees and capture an incredible myriad of policies and actions that have been undertaken by those organizations. And that, for me, is the standout power of these data. Because we're able to capture the same organizations over time, we're able to explore how those organizations have evolved in terms of their workplace settings, their policies and actions, and we're able to associate those actions with outcomes in terms of pay or progression. That is the absolute standout distinctiveness of these these data. And as the data have matured over time, the power of the data have been literally enhanced year on year. So it's very hard to pick a single thing, but for me, it's the capacity to be able to associate and link actions to outcomes that have been, just so rewarding to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've lost count of how many times I've cited the research findings and indeed the excellent work from Wijia. Now, I'm going to...
Catherine, can I just take an opportunity, because I shouldn't miss it, because I'm sure many on the call are the ones who collect that and provide and report that information to us from employers. We're very conscious it's a massive job for employers across Australia to do that, and it's because of that work that sits in each and every workplace that enables us to, Alan to do the analysis and us to be able to have this incredible data set. So I just wanted to call out all the work that happens on the ground to make it a reality.
Yes, and it is a considerable amount of work, incredibly worthwhile, but yes, someone has to actually, well, people have to do that. So absolutely, good point to make. Look, someone has asked us if the slide deck will be made available afterwards. Yes, it will. So be assured you can use that slide deck. Now, in a way, I suspect we've already touched on this, but maybe I'll ask each of the panelists now. Someone's asked, what's the top action employers can take from this research study that will make the biggest difference to drive gender balance? So it's always very difficult to pick one out, but Michelle, looking at this year's report, is there a particular area you would nominate?
Oh, it's such a big question. So thank you to whoever has asked that question. All I will say is that it evolves. Our focus has evolved over the last 9 years since we set an ambition to be gender balanced back in 2016. And that was when we were around 17% women in our workforce, and we knew we had a long way to go, and many didn't believe that we could actually get there. But we had to really start with some basic infrastructure. And so for us in mining, that means importantly just security, as well as female gyms and access to the physical environment. But then we also went into things like making sure that people felt psychologically safe. And so we invested a lot in what was respectful behaviours and bystander training. But as we have matured, we've actually seen that actually childcare is something that we really need to focus on, because it helps give flexibility, or it helps enable women to work some of the rosters and the shifts that we have in front of them. And to Alan's research, we have focused quite a fair bit on retention, promotion pathways, learning and development. That's been a real focus for us of late.
Yeah. Have you had an uptick? I mean, we know nationally more men are now taking paid parental leave. Is that something that you've observed? I know in the early days in the mining sector, very few men were actually taking it, even though it was available.
Absolutely, that's spot on. We get very excited when we see the data on uptake of parental leave, and we look at both female as well as male, and our male levels are the highest that they've been for many years, and we're really excited that that keeps growing year on year.
So that's keeping on going. Terrific. Mary, if you had to cherry pick.
I'll pick two, if that's all right. People won't be surprised. Using the data, doing the analysis, and doing it at a level of detail. Obviously, the Wijia data is collected with a purpose to help people do that analysis, and we suggest doing it even more comprehensively to understand where the gaps are and what's driving it and where those differentials are. And Michelle talked a little bit about using the data to find out, creating the opportunity to dig in more deeply and then come up with the solution. So the analysis is absolutely critical, but then using that to create an action plan and having an accountability around the outcomes, so that the data continues to be a driver of and measure an accountability mechanism around the change. So the power of that analysis. The second thing, and it goes a little bit to just the comments on parental leave and those sorts of things, is we do have a lot of very entrenched stereotypes in the Australian context, and really breaking down the ideal carer norm and the ideal worker norm, which is, male and female as the carer, to really, creating that environment, the culture within a workplace and hopefully over time, as a nation, where, people can participate, women and men can equally participate throughout their careers at the most senior levels, or in whatever way suits them in terms of their interests and capabilities. So I think thinking constantly about how we can diminish the stereotypes that exist, in whatever industry we're operating in, to shared care and the translation of that into gender equal workplaces.
Yeah, fantastic. Alan, that one about gender norms, I haven't read this recently, but I know there has been some research showing that Australia has actually very traditional gender norms quite embedded and compared to the OECD, for example. Is that still the case?
I think it is, and I reckon that does go a long way to explain why we see the sort of level of inertia in some sectors and some sort of occupational spheres. So we're looking to, as I say, shift the dial on young people's aspirations, on what they could regard as in scope for future career journeys, supported by obviously families, schools, and higher education sectors. I think it's so important, and that's why I was so impressed, hearing Michelle talk about, their, very focused and intentional approach to broadening sort of pipelines and breaking down, the sort of gendered barriers to what will be regarded as a career aspiration. So yeah, I think both your point is true. But it's encouraging that we're, some organisations such as BHP are picking that and really, attacking it head on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. All right, a couple of sort of quicker questions. Re-participation on boards. Whoever sent the question, I don't have the name, sorry. I saw the ASX boards data, but was the disparity between paid boards and volunteer boards looked at? I imagine not. Is that?
No, it's we don't have data that would allow us to separate salaried board membership versus volunteer board membership. Certainly within these data. However, again, it would be I think it's an interesting exercise should such data exist and should they be available from other sources.
Yep, indeed. All right, now third question, which I suspect Michelle would be best placed to answer. How can employers with less flexible workplaces, such as mining and manufacturing, shift the dial towards more gender balance? And I think Michelle, you've already touched on this, but it'd be great to get some practical insights on that.
Yeah, sounds great. And it's something that we're still honestly grappling with in terms of how to provide genuine flexibility from a number of different dimensions. But there's a clue in that as well, which it is multi-dimensional. I was on site recently in WA at one of our operations, and in one of the towns there where we support a lot of our workers, the childcare was limited to just standard 9 to 5 hours. And when you're working a 12-hour shift, that can be really challenging to do pick up and drop off. And so what BHP has invested in partnership with other community providers, is actually a way of thinking about how can we provide childcare outside of normal hours. And so there was this kind of setup. It's like a childcare mecca in this town, where individuals can go, and if they've got last minute work that they need to do and they don't have childcare arrangements, they can actually take their kids there and work in a great environment where people really do understand. And so we're trying to tackle a little bit of the multiple dimensions that occur around flexibility. I mentioned before around just redeploying people so that the work fits their stage of life as well. That's another angle that we have taken.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting, when I first started in journalism quite a few decades back, and I joined Fairfax, which was a family-owned company at the time. They had a childcare centre which was subsidised, and they opened early and closed late because it was for people working in media, and it made a huge amount of difference to us. Yeah, it's such an important one. Now,
so Catherine, can I just jump in on that? And I think where Michelle started is really, really important. It's a little disappointing that flexible work is becoming synonymous with working from home. And we know that in the majority of cases, working from home is actually not an option for most people who are working. And so it's really important, and it goes back to that analysis and understanding, and particularly on things like resignation rates and during exit interviews, is what does flexibility mean? What does it need to look like? Can it include things like job share for senior roles? And really, I think getting executives and leaders' head around this capability to work differently, importantly at the most senior levels, because we know that flexibility tends to drop dramatically at the more senior levels of management and access. And Alan's study last year, delved into this a little bit as well. But it's really important that flexibility has a broad definition to reflect, the age, the demographic, the needs of the workforce.
Yeah, and also over a career. We sort of, that idea that you have to be on this up or out sort of trajectory in many ways. Cracking on, probably this is best for Alan, appreciating that Australia is very fortunate to have this incredible data set. And the agency, of course, is the same observation about balance and company value demonstrated in other parts of the world. I'm sort of picking up from you earlier that possibly not. Are other countries doing this better and more aggressively?
Look, there are some instances and some pieces of research which do, reveal, similar positive associations. I've seen some work in Europe and the US, which also match some of these conclusions. Let's say the Australian context, it's relatively new, but no, I think. The evidence is there, the evidence is building. And when you think about it, I don't think the evidence is controversial. If you've got a diversity of opinion around the board table, if you've got a full information set on which to base your strategic decisions, then, how can that be anything other than helpful to guide company strategy and company policy and company progress? So I do. I'm just encouraged that we've been able to generate sort of a hard evidence base to drive home that message.
Yeah. Fantastic. So next question is from Kaylee Otter. She's keen to hear your thoughts, I imagine from the panel, on how workplaces may or may not be fostering menopause-friendly workplaces, and the impact, really interesting, that could be having on female retention rates, especially at the managerial level. And then that's a good point to make, isn't it? Because it's that sort of age bracket that we'd be looking at, given, as she says, the average age range for women experiencing menopause is 45 to 55. So just wonder if we've got any insights on that. Alan, did you want to have any?
I can kick off, certainly. Interestingly, the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre has undertaken some work for Health Services Union, looking specifically at the costs and benefits of paid leave for reproductive health and other health conditions. And as part of that, we undertook a survey to identify what the perceptions were in organizations and what the provisions were in organizations of different forms of paid reproductive leave. You're quite right that there are, significant risks of losing a really, significant talent pool of women as they're, approaching, the period where menopause comes into play. But we also found that where organizations, had, incorporated sort of leave provisions where, from a line management perspective, there was an understanding and an empathy and the opportunity for flexibility to be in place to manage the sort of these conditions. organizations, then that materially affected the attitude of women towards remaining in place rather than taking early retirement.
Yeah.
And it's and we know just how costly turnover and recruitment is, and so as much as organizations can do in that regard, I think it would be a benefit both to the employees but also to the business.
And maybe just to build on that, Catherine, just a fun little anecdote. I've met some male senior leaders in our organisation who have very proudly become allies on educating others around menopause, whether it's because their wives are going through it or other family members or people in their teams. That's been really powerful for us to normalise the conversation around it. And sometimes we've got policies, but other times really working through these sort of informal means can be very powerful for us. But more broadly, in a mining context, when I was talking about ensuring that we have the right facilities and workplace to embrace women, we've had to really think about what happens when women are menstruating and we need access to bathrooms when you're underground or in fairly remote areas. So that's something that has gone into the design of our facilities.
Yeah, and we're certainly hearing more discussion in a very broad context about medical misogyny, women's reproductive health outcomes, and so on. So I sense we're sort of at the tip of the iceberg in a way, but this sounds as though it's something that will come up on the agenda.
Can I jump in just to, I suppose, a moderating perspective on things is that our look at sort of broad evidence in relation to this, though, is things like flexibility, things like access to personal leave, those sorts of things can be the solution rather than access to specific dedicated leave or support in relation to menopause. And that, in fact, Jean Hale's Centre has done some work that surveyed women about their nervousness of engaging on or medicalising, in some ways, issues around menopause, especially for non-managerial, potentially having to talk to younger men or different, that might be their managers and those sorts of things. So definitely need to normalise, the range of conversations in the workplace, but that many of the things that we're talking about that can benefit people at different stages of their career, such as flexibility, which is helpful when you're caring, could be helpful in relation to menopause, could be important for caring for elderly parents. That actually the application of workplaces that are responsive to the needs of the employer at whatever age and stage they're at in terms of their careers, can be the solution for retaining women in the workplace through those older ages, rather than it having to be specific to menopause.
Yeah, I hear that too. That's coming through loud and clear. Now, I've got a couple of questions left, and I calculate around 2 minutes, but let me at least pose them and we could perhaps have a very quick response. Do we have data on the reasons for the higher resignation rates amongst women, which I think we do, but I just will pose that one. And Heidi Waterson said she'd love to hear whether there will be further analysis on difference in experience of employees and employers beyond identity of women and men. So First Nations, people of disability or chronic health conditions. So I rolled 2 questions together there. The first one was the reasons for the resignation rates. Second one is broadening that issue of diversity. Very happy for anyone to answer that. So maybe the resignation issues. Alan, was there anything that you could point to?
Look, the reasons, stated reasons for heightened resignation rates. We don't have perceptions of information from the employee, so we can only infer from complementary studies and data sources, and indeed evidence on the ground from the likes of BHP and some of the comments that Michelle has made. So we have to make more inference than draw conclusions from the WGEA data set per se. But the fact is that the WGEA data set has thrown up this as an observable feature, and I think that's strong.
Yeah, and Michelle, you did mention before what you'd captured within BHP about those reasons. Just a quick recap on maybe 2 or 3 of them that you mentioned.
Yeah, point number one is it's not static, so you do need to watch it over time. It does change with the environmental factors and other sort of internal and external factors. And some of the thematics that we see are really around career and development opportunities, the nature of the leadership that the individual feels and receives and perceives. And in addition, just having the type of work that fits for the stage of life for an individual. Those are really coming up. Pay and benefits always comes up and down, and was up recently last year for us because of the cost of living crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mary, maybe that second one about looking at the experience of employees and employers around those different areas of diversity.
Yeah, no, it's an important question. We've actually been doing quite a lot of work to see if we could collect broader data. We are now collecting both age and location data, which enables us to do a bit of an intersectional analysis over time. We will be able to, and on those aspects. But there are some serious issues with both the collection of the data and the quality of the data that employers collect, because we know that it's very challenging to collect accurate data, and then the privacy associated with what is already very extensive reporting to AGEA. What has been good to see is the recent Jobs and Skills Australia report in relation to gender pay gaps on occupations, and using HILDA data and other linked government data sets to do analysis, an intersectional analysis in that context around culturally and linguistically diverse employees, as well as employees with a disability. So there is a high commitment and interest to be able to do a more nuanced analysis, but it's challenging to think that it might be able to happen within the WGEA data set. So we're working through that with government.
Yeah, working through it. All right, now this is definitely our last question. It's a big one, but let's see if we can at least provide a little bit of clarity. What's being done to attract, retain and develop more men in female-dominated sectors? Are there plans for more pay increases because there's a substantial barrier for men going into caring industries, for example? How do we overcome the gendered backlash associated with what can be a highly emotive area, especially around things like childcare, and what we've seen with some of the awful events in childcare. So I know that's a big question, but if there's anything any of you would like to add on that, I think it would be it's sometimes something that is slightly left behind when we have these discussions. So yeah, any thoughts? Maybe Mary, you could kick us off.
Yeah, well, I think Alan's analysis has showed that we actually need gender balance of, both masculinized and feminized industries, and that there are benefits in moving towards that balance. And I think, to be honest, feminized industries have certainly from our data been less proactive in relation to this, because we've got lots of women, we don't need to bother. They've been lower on gender pay gap analysis, they've been lower on taking action as a result. And I think we're really bringing a highlight that it needs to happen at both ends. We won't meet the care needs of the Australian population if we are only recruiting from 50% of the workforce to fulfil healthcare and social assistance industry growth over time. So anecdotally, we're already hearing that the increase in the aged care wage is leading to an increase in men who are applying for those positions. So I think the person who wrote the question is on the mark there in terms of pay, and that's going to be good for everyone in the industry and important. So we need to keep focusing on that, but also making sure that we do have a particular focus, not just on women into masculinized industries, but feminized as well.
Thank you so much. We really are on time now. I want to thank each of our panellists, Alan, Mary and Michelle. That was a fantastic conversation. I wish we could keep it going. And I just wanted to finish by saying that I hope those of you who are still with us, that you found today clarifying, but also motivating. I think at the moment it's a turbulent period, but we have so much in Australia to build on. And it's fantastic to hear the industry insights, as well as, of course, the richness of the data. You can find more information and download the report. There's the QR code there at bcec.edu.au, and much to think about. Thank you again for joining us.